Whether we like to admit it or not, Western Europe is the birthplace of the modern world. It's currently one of the safest and most prosperous regions on the planet, with some of the highest standards of living and very few interstate military conflicts. However, it hasn't always been that way. For most of Europe's history, the continent was engulfed with warring tribes, clans, kingdoms, empires, states, and religions, all vying for control. Let's have a disgustingly oversimplified history of the continent and its geography. Speaking of geography, Europe really isn't a continent. As you can tell, there are no major bodies of water here separating Asia from Europe. Europe is really a peninsula composed of many smaller peninsulas off of the greater Eurasian landmass. This is separated by the Ural Mountains in Russia and the Caspian Sea. It's astonishing how much we learn in school is actual bullshit. Anyway, most of Europe has a temperate climate with relatively warm temperatures given its latitude. This is due to the Gulf Stream, which pushes warm currents from the Gulf of Mexico to Europe. Hence why Rome and Istanbul have warm Mediterranean climates, while another city roughly on the same latitude, like Toronto, is a frozen hellscape. Europe also has numerous mountain chains, most notably the Alps, as well as small countless ranges of mountains and hills. Mountains and waterways oftentimes act as barriers to movement and cultural exchange, which might explain why there are so many varying ethnic groups and identities on the European continent. Europe is also home to numerous navigable rivers, most notably the Danube and the Rhine, both of which act as major transport highways and support major population centers. Despite being very mountainous, Europe does have flat land, namely the unoriginally named European Plain, stretching from the coast of France, the Low Countries, northern Germany, Poland, the Baltic states, and Russia. Due to this lack of natural barriers, these portions of the continent are the most vulnerable to land invasions. However, they also have some of the best farmland. Europe not only benefits from a system of rivers, but also a large system of lakes, temperate climate, and access to the Atlantic Ocean, along with various seas such as the Mediterranean, North Sea, and Black Sea. Surprisingly, Europe does have some deserts as well, but they're usually semi-arid, small, and kinda pathetic. Regardless of this, Europe suffers from a relative lack of natural resources. While there is plenty of timber, water, coal, farmland, and fish, there is relatively little in mineral wealth and hydrocarbon resources. The only places with a substantial amount of oil are Norway and the UK, with their marine territories in the North Sea. This is part of the reason why Norway is not a member of the EU, as, sharing oil kinda sucks. And now on to a disgustingly oversimplified overview of European history. Trying to condense all of Europe's history in order to better explain its future prospects is bound to fail, but I'm gonna try anyway. First, there were some pre-Indo-European people. They didn't write anything, so we don't know much about them other than them building these weird stone thingies. The Basques in Spain are arguably the last remnants of these people. Later on, Indo-Europeans with their horses and wheeled carts and their own language migrated to the continent from the Ukrainian steppes or Turkey. Nearly all European languages come from their proto language, except for the Basques, Hungarians, and Finns. And some others I will skip over for the sake of not making this video 7 hours long. The first complex civilization in Europe were the Minoans on Crete in modern-day Greece. They exploded to death probably due to this volcano. Then the Mycenaeans came to dominate mainland Greece. A number of city-states popped up, namely Athens and Sparta. The Persians, led by this drag queen-looking guy, tried to conquer them but failed, as the Greeks united. But then after the Persians were defeated, the Greeks went back to fighting each other. The Greeks also set up colonies around the Mediterranean, most notably in Italy, where they would influence another civilization that shared their love of homoerotic artwork. After halting the Persian advance, Athens had a golden age, with advances in philosophy, science, medicine, literature, drama, religion, technology, democracy, and pederasty. This is really where Western civilization begins. Then we'll fast forward to Alexander the Great of Macedonia, who takes over most of Greece, conquers Persia, goes as far as India, but then dies to either a fever or a rupturing of his liver due to too much alcohol. We've almost all been there. He goes on to spread Greek culture far and wide before dying. Further west are the aforementioned Latins, found in what is now called Rome. They conquer much of the Italian peninsula, create a republic, defeat their main rival Carthage, and start to invade those parts of Europe with the crappier weather, either by killing or subjugating the Celtic and Germanic populations. Don't feel too bad for those Celts though, many of them were gingers, and therefore aren't really people. The Roman Republic eventually got turned into an empire under Caesar and his adopted son Augustus. Under this same time as Augustus, a fellow named Jesus was born in modern-day Palestine/Israel. The Romans first persecuted his followers until this guy, Constantine, decided to make Christianity the official religion, and he also found Constantinople. This would later be the eastern capital of the Roman Empire, and home to Orthodox Christianity. This is due to the split between the Eastern and Western Roman Empire. In the West, there would be the Catholic Church, as you are all familiar with. The empire would eventually get overrun by Germanic tribes and the Huns. Rome would eventually get sacked by Germanic tribes, the Western Empire would collapse into feudalism, and this kind of sucked unless you like eating cabbage gruel as a serf. Eventually, one Germanic tribe, called the Franks, led by Charlemagne, would unite much of Central Europe with the help of the Pope, and spread Christianity to the pagans, sometimes through education, and sometimes through mass murder. Eventually, you would see the rise of the Vikings raiding and trading across Europe, and eventually landing in the Americas. Meanwhile, Muslim armies would push into Europe from Spain, get halted by the Martells, and in the meantime, the Eastern Roman Empire, which was dominated by Greeks, would eventually request the Pope in Rome for some help in fighting the Muslim Turks, who were threatening Jerusalem. European Christians would launch several crusades ranging from minor successes to complete epic failures, including one where they would eventually sack the Christian city of Constantinople. At the time, the Muslim world was far more socially and technologically advanced. This script would later be flipped several centuries later. The next time Europeans occupied the Middle East en masse would be the colonialism of Britain, France, and Italy in the 20th century. Eventually, the Black Death would sweep in, wiping out a massive chunk of Europe's population. Some people think it was God's will who did it, or the devil, or the Jews, but in reality it was actually bacteria on fleas on rats. After a long time of kind of being shit, a rebirth in art and science occurred in Europe, namely in Italy, especially Florence. You might know this as the Renaissance. Another city-state that prospered during this era, and honestly, long after it, is Venice. Meanwhile, around the rise of Venice, the Ottoman Turks, who are Muslim, would eventually conquer Constantinople, marking the end of the Eastern Roman Empire and the Middle Ages as we know it. The Ottomans would block trade route opportunities for European Christians. This was at a time when Europeans started to take serious interest in the Orient, namely India and China. So Portugal decided to bypass the Ottomans, setting up trade posts in Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and being the first Europeans to contact Japan. The Ottoman expansion would eventually come to a halt at the gates of Vienna, Austria. Next to Portugal is Spain, which had recently united from smaller kingdoms. It had kicked out the Islamic powers in the south and the Jews. This was before the coexist shirt was mass-produced. The Spanish also hired a guy by the name of Christopher Columbus to sail to the Orient, but instead he landed in the Bahamas, Hispaniola, and Cuba. The native populations of the Americas got decimated through diseases, which they had no immunity to. The Spanish set up a system of farming, forcing the natives to be, well, farmers/slaves, but they kept dying from diseases, so they had to import slaves, hence the transatlantic slave trade. This was actually first started by the Portuguese, so don't entirely blame the Spanish. Spain would eventually conquer the Aztecs in Mesoamerica and the Incan Empire in the Andes. They would spread Christianity, intermarry with the local populations, and mine enough silver and gold to get rich enough to create inflation to send their economy into the shitter, from paradoxically having too much money. There was also this guy called Martin Luther, living in what is now Germany, and he had some issues with the Pope, who would eventually excommunicate him for criticizing the Pope. This would start the Protestant Reformation, and Europeans would spend roughly 30 years fighting over it. Eventually, for the most part, Catholics and Protestants would settle their differences, signing the Peace of Westphalia, which provides the bedrock for the notion of the sovereign state and international law. Other Europeans would take jabs at the Americas, like the Portuguese in Brazil, France in Quebec and Haiti, the Dutch in what is now New York, and most of all, the English. They set up some colonies, and a 7-year war started between Britain and France. Britain would eventually become triumphant, taking over what is now Canada and gaining control over India, as well as starting to settle Australia and New Zealand. Around this time period would emerge the Enlightenment. This would be a 1700s equivalent of owning people with facts and logic. By this time, England and Scotland would unite, America would kick the Brits out and become independent, and the French would snip off their king's head. Napoleon would do some conquering and spread Enlightenment values while simultaneously being an empire. He would die in exile, but his legacy spreads nationalistic fervor. This fervor would inspire ideas that would eventually lead to the unification of what is now Italy and Germany. By this time, Britain is the most powerful, would continue to colonize other parts of the globe, and would be the first country to industrialize. Other Europeans would follow suit in both colonialism and industrialism, as they needed resources. And what do you know, there's a whole continent to the south with plenty of resources. Let's go pillage them. Eventually, the balance of power would shift away from purely being in Britain's hands. Germany, in particular, would become very powerful, and this rise of nationalism across the board would break out into World War I, as entangling alliances clashed. Germany would lose, and get slapped with all the blame, despite only really deserving part of it. Its empire would collapse, along with its allies, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Turks. This unfair treaty was called the Treaty of Versailles. The Great War was called the War to End All Wars. Spoiler alert, it didn't end anything, hence why we call World War I, World War I. This humiliation, along with the rise of more nationalism and an even more extreme version of it, fascism, would lead to the rise of Mussolini in Italy, the Spanish Civil War, and most of all, the Nazis. Now, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of World War II, as there are already 500 billion videos on the subject matter. All you need to know is that the Nazis and their allies were defeated by Britain, the USSR, and the USA. Berlin would get split in two, and Germany would get split into two. In fact, Europe altogether would be split into two between a pro-US side and a pro-USSR side. With the European powers in shambles, a bunch of brown people all around the world that they mistreated wanted their own land back, hence decolonization. After causing the bloodiest conflict in human history, many Europeans came to the conclusion, hey, this war thing, kinda sucks. So the first steps of European integration began. On security matters, the US would not only help rebuild much of Western Europe, but also set up NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in order to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. This mutual defense pact was put in place to thwart any Soviet aggression. An attack on one would be an attack on all. And with the Marshall Plan, the US would have no problem pouring tons of money to rebuild Europe, so long as they said no to those commie bastards. Churchill would speak of a United States of Europe, a hypothetical single sovereign state organized as a federation modeled after the United States. But Europe, with very firm historical, unique identities, rejected this. They opted for a more low-key integration instead, so the Council of Europe was founded shortly after World War II based on these principles. However, France was still deeply worried about Germany for obvious reasons, so they set up the European Coal and Steel Community. Coal and steel were the two core war resources, so integrating German and French industries would make them less likely to go to war. In the 50s, the European Economic Community was developed as customs unions followed by, and the European Atomic Energy Community as well, in order to help develop nuclear energy. In the 1980s, the Schengen Region Agreement would create open borders between some European nations. Eventually, communism would collapse in Eastern Europe, and many former USSR allies would see closer ties to Western Europe and the United States instead of Russia. Lastly, in 1997, a treaty created the EU. This would be followed by a monetary union, the euro, implemented in 2002. Did I explain the context well enough? Probably not. There's probably a lot more European geography and history I could get into, but let's press forward and figure out if the EU has a potential to be a world superpower, which we'll cover in part 2 of this video series. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.